Yeah, it's about 200 something. Should be all right. Buonasera, vi do il benvenuto a questa lezione del professore Roel STERCKX, che è il Joseph Needham Professor di Storia, Scienza e Civiltà cinese all'Università di Cambridge. Ha studiato la Cina all'Università di Leuven nel Belgio e poi è andato all'Università di Taiwan, dove ha studiato filosofia e la Cina dell'antichità, e ha poi preso il suo dottorato all'Università di Cambridge ed è rimasto lì, come spesso succede, fino ai nostri giorni. La sua cattedra, devo dirvi, è tra le più prestigiose di cattedre cinesi al mondo. Il suo specialismo è la civiltà cinese, la storia culturale, la storia delle religioni. In particolare ha una curiosità antropologica verso i testi e la cultura materiale. Molte delle sue riflessioni sono state ispirate da questioni inerenti alla storia delle scienze e soprattutto è interessato nel modo nel quale il mondo naturale e la visione del mondo naturale fu organizzato nella Cina antica. E in particolare ha anche scritto molto su questo argomento, sul ruolo centrale del cibo nella civiltà e nella politica cinese. Abbiamo pensato che questo era un tema importante anche perché negli ultimi 40 o 50 anni in Europa e anche in Italia la conoscenza del cibo cinese, che era quasi zero 40-50 anni fa, io so che negli anni 50 a Milano c'era un ristorante cinese solo e molti pensavano che l'unica cosa che si mangiasse in un ristorante cinese erano i cani, dunque avevano delle difficoltà di public relations, e invece adesso, come sapete, ci sono ristoranti cinesi dappertutto. Ma per la maggior parte delle persone la conoscenza del cibo cinese rimane confinato al ruolo dei ristoranti, e pensate che naturalmente il cibo dei ristoranti cinesi non solo è adattato al gusto europeo, ma è il cibo di una regione, o prevalentemente di una regione della Cina. E dunque sono molto contento di avere tra di noi uno dei massimi esperti nel campo della tradizione culinaria cinese e dell'importanza del cibo in Cina, e do la parola al professore STERCKX, che naturalmente parlerà in inglese, e chi di voi e non in cinese, perché potrebbe farlo, il suo cinese pare perfetto. E dunque, Roel, a te.
Grazie Donald. Buonasera, vorrei cominciare la mia presentazione esprimendo sia la mia gratitudine che il mio rammarico. Gratitudine verso gli organizzatori che mi hanno gentilmente invitato a partecipare in questo convegno. Mi conforta e mi gratifica sapere che la storia cinese sta diventando sempre di più parte della cultura generale. Detto questo, devo anche esprimere il mio rammarico e la mia frustrazione, ormai di vecchia data, dovuta al fatto che non sono mai riuscito a imparare la lingua di Dante ad un livello che mi permettesse oggi di tenere questa conferenza in italiano. Per questo vi chiedo scusa e spero che non vi dispiaccia troppo se vi porterò nel mondo dell'antica Cina usando la lingua di Shakespeare. Molto grazie. If one were to identify one feature of Chinese culture that has characterized so much of the cultural capital it has fostered within its own borders as well as in the outside world, a preoccupation with food would no doubt rank amongst the most likely answers. Few cultures have put more emphasis on the central role of food preparation and food consumption in both a secular and a religious context. The fascination with food throughout the Chinese world, in the past and in the present, has led some to remark that in order to understand Chinese sensitivities about the world at large, one needs to accept that the Chinese first and foremost seek to taste and digest the world around them. The Chinese writer and scholar Lin Yutang, who you have on the slide here, he went as far as remarking that the Chinese mind, because of its food-orientedness, failed to develop a solid tradition in the biological sciences, as it could not refrain from reducing what was knowable to what was edible. Right? He says the reason why the Chinese failed to develop botany and zoology is that the Chinese scholar cannot stare coldly and unemotionally at a fish without thinking immediately of how it tastes in the mouth and wanting to eat it. Now, Chinese scientists working in laboratories today will undoubtedly smile at Lin Yutang's remarks here, but if we leave the rhetoric aside, it is fair to say that food and foodways have pervaded Chinese thinking from its very origins up to the present day. Food was also central to the world of Chinese religion, and very few cultures have put more emphasis or devoted more writings than the ancient Chinese to the preparation and the consumption of food for and by the spirit world in the form of sacrifices. The slides here, these are shots taken at a temple in Hong Kong today. This is probably a scene you would have found 2,500 years ago in China. Now, Chinese ritual texts suggest that at all levels of Chinese society, social communication and communication with the spirit world was achieved through the palate and the stomach. Now, before we proceed, much of what I will have to say today is based mostly on information that we have in texts that were roughly composed between the 6th century BC and the 1st century BC. In Chinese historiography, this period is traditionally referred to as the Warring States period and the early imperial period. And if you look on the maps here on this slide, you know, the bits that are colored in, these are the areas of civilization that we will be talking about. So it does not coincide with the borders of the People's Republic of China today. If you were to compare this roughly on a timeline, we are in the age of Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great in ancient Greece, and we end roughly at the time of the late Republic and the dawn of the Augustan period in Rome. And this is a very fundamental period, very important period in Chinese history, because this is the period when China gradually evolved from a confederacy of little states into a unified empire, which some of you may know from the terracotta warriors and the first emperor's story that, you know, gets access to museums in Europe quite regularly. So I will be talking about the relationship between food and the physical and the moral well-being of both the living and the departed. And by the departed, I mean ancestral spirits. The Chinese very often defined sacrificing, or in other words, offering sacrifices, they defined this as feeding one's ancestor or nourishing the dead. And so unlike the Greeks, early Chinese religion was not really preoccupied with a world of deities and spirits that were living entirely detached from the human world. In Chinese religion, it is ancestors and ancestral worship that is at the heart, of all activities. I mean, still today, you pray to the ancestors, as you see on the left slide, if you want your son or daughter to get into university, and on the right, you sacrifice to, ancestors by offering them food. So we need to keep this in mind when we talk about Chinese religion and the worship of spirits. We are talking about predominantly about ancestors. And these ancestors could be ancestors that are very close to you. It could be your father, it could be your deceased grandmother, and so on. Or these could be people who go way back in the lineage that are no longer so fresh in the memory of the living. So feeding the dead was as important as catering for the living. And as we go along this evening, I hope to give you a sense of how culinary culture in China provided not only nourishment to people, but also a treasure of images and metaphors that are associated with topics such as human self-cultivation, with government, and even with politics. Now, let us turn first now to the way in which the bodies of the living were to be catered for. We don't have many sources from ancient China that actually describe food as such, that describe food as a culinary world, so to speak. And interestingly, the types of sources where we find most information are medical. And it is one such source, which we know as the Rites of Zhou, which you have on the slide here, that is very interesting in that regard. This is a text that speaks of an ideal world, an ideal empire, in which every official takes charge of specific tasks. And in that particular text, we have tens of officers that are designated with catering for the ruler. They need to cook for the ruler, they need to find ingredients and so on. Officials such as winemakers, spice officers, salt stewards, and so on. And now there's one very interesting official amongst the list of officers we have in this source, and that is the dietary physician. And the dietary physician is in charge basically of cooking, as you can see on the slide here. And what's interesting in the description of what he does is two things. Cooking is described as harmonizing foodstuffs, blending them together. And secondly, cooking is presented as an activity in which the cook follows the seasons. In other words, it's an engagement with the cosmos at large, in which you prepare ingredients according to the passage of time, because there is a direct relationship between the well-being of the person you feed and the ingredients that you offer to a person depending on the seasons. I won't read out the details of this particular description, but keep in mind that nourishment and diet is conceived of as an act to preserve good health. Chinese ritual texts don't seem to be distinguishing very clearly between feeding for pleasure and maintaining a healthy body. And that is almost parallel to the Chinese medical tradition, where the boundaries between food as nutrition and food as medicine are very often blurred. Now, I'd want to go back again to this idea of harmony and harmonizing, cooking as an act in which you blend ingredients together according to a seasonal logic, as in this particular quote. we will see later that this emphasis on harmony or balance amongst ingredients is also reflected in sacrificial literature, in literature that deals with prescriptions on how you should feed your ancestors. Because in sacrificial literature, the sacrificial stew, a kind of soup, will become central. And we are going to say a little bit more about that later. Now, we know from our texts that food is meant to influence the behavior of the ruler or of the people you cater for, that it has a psychosomatic effect. We don't have many sources that explain exactly, how this happens, but here and there, if we look in Chinese historical text, we find little traces of how this may have been conceived of in practice. Because in these historiographical texts, now and then, we learn that the main element that links physical health with mental health and ultimately the potential to function as a very efficient person, as a very good ruler, is the notion of qi, which is the one term probably most of you will have heard somewhere when people talk about China. It's also the one term that has been translated and mistranslated most than any other character in the Chinese language. So I'm simply going to translate this as saying qi. Qi is qi. Now, qi originally denotes the vapors that were rising out of sacrificial vessels during offerings to the spirit world. So it is basically a kind of stuff, kind of rough stuff, energy. Now look at this particular quote here, which comes out of a historiographical text, and it describes the way in which a particular man of power was set, to gain a lucid mind. A cook says that flavor in ingredients is something that will promote your circulation of qi. Qi gives fullness to your mind, and the mind is something you use to talk. The mind fixes your words. And of course, if you know how to fix your words and talk properly, then of course you are ready to issue commands. So if you are a military commander, you need to make sure you are being nourished in the right way. Otherwise, you are not going to be clear in the types of orders and instructions that you might deliver, to your soldier. So this idea that looking after the body of your superior, of your ruler, and that is a way in which you ensure that he is capable, to function properly, that really is the key notion we find in dietary codes and guidelines on dining etiquette in ancient China, especially as it concerns rulers, kings and later emperors. So according to one text, a king was expected to take 4 meals a day, simply to symbolize that he had the products of the 4 seasons and the 4 quarters, the 4 directions of his empire at his disposal. Ingesting food becomes, if you are a person of significance, a way to maintain the cosmos at large. Here you have an example of this. A king sits in the center and he controls the 4 directions of his particular empire. What does he do? In the morning he takes a meal, and that meal has to have ingredients that support the lesser yang powers. At noon he takes a meal, and that is the beginning of the greater yang. In the afternoon he takes a meal, which gets him into the yin phase, and in the evening he takes a meal, and that gets him into the greater yin phase. Yin and yang, again 2 terms you will have heard of, simply a way of describing the complementary nature, of everything that exists around us. Now, all of this sounds very philosophical and very theoretical, but it's clear from Chinese calendars, from Chinese sources that feeding your ruler according to a seasonal logic was more than simply symbolism. So I'm going to jump in time to late imperial China to illustrate this, because we have far more records for this period. It appears from the 18th century, or from records from the 18th century, that feeding, the forbidden city, the complex in Beijing, which was, sort of the resort of the emperor and the imperial family. Well, feeding the forbidden city was a very complex and expensive operation. For instance, the cost for the year 1757 has been estimated at 9,540 ounces of silver. That's a significant amount of silver. We have thousands of menus preserved, and they give us an insight into what pleased the palate of one particular emperor, that is the Qianlong emperor you have on the slide here. Now, here is a description of a light breakfast in 1779. I'm not going to read through it because, as you can say, you couldn't possibly eat through, what is being described here. But what we have in these records are menus, imperial menus, that sometimes feature more than 90 dishes. In 1779, this particular emperor, the Qianlong emperor, we are told, went through 140 ducks and chickens in 1 month. Now, at this point, you may be wondering why not all Chinese emperors ended up being so overweight or unable to get through the many gates and pavilions of the Forbidden City. Of course, the emperor didn't consume the menu himself. What happened is that sometimes he would only touch the food, and then the leftovers and the dishes would be distributed, with his concubines, or they were sent as gifts following protocol to princes, to princesses, to officials and dignitaries. And often the emperor would symbolically, sort of only present himself, for breakfast without really consuming very much. But what is central in this daily display of incredible amounts and varieties of food brings us back, to the ritual texts of early imperial China. The idea is that the emperor, who was also known as the Son of Heaven, the emperor rules over a vast territory, and that territory stretches miles beyond the walls of his court. And so he had to symbolically demonstrate that he was in touch with the whole world by consuming or symbolically consuming foodstuffs and sampling the products and flavors from every corner of his empire. So ordinary people were thought to be happy and healthy when consuming their local products, but the emperor had to have a cosmic meal. That means he had to eat and sample all the tastes that existed in his empire. His diet, therefore, had to change with the seasons. Even the layout of the dishes sometimes followed the geography of his empire. So you would have southern ingredients that were put on the southern part of the table, and so on. So on a symbolical level then, the Chinese emperor governed the world through consuming the ingredients it generated. Now, from feeding the living, I'd like to say a few things about feeding the dead. What happens when an aristocrat in early China died was that as soon as death had set in, and prior to burial, the oral cavity of the body was stuffed with jade or shells. And the amount of jade and the amount of shells all dependent on the rank of the person in question. You see an example here on the slides of a jade suit, which would have been a burial suit, in this case of a Han king. And in the left slide, you see jade plugs, 2 for the eyes, 1 for each nostril, and then the cicada, the jade cicada, which would go into the mouth. Now, what at first sight simply looks as plugging up the oral cavities of the dead may have been related to a significance that touches on food, because the Chinese ritual code calls this process in Chinese with a term that means feeding the corpse. So the Chinese term that describes putting the jade plug into the mouth of the deceased essentially means feeding the dead corpse. Now, of course, for the early period, we don't have much direct evidence that attempts were actually made to physically feed a corpse. But anthropologists have documented that as recent as the early 1980s in Taiwan, mourners sometimes put food in the mouth of the deceased. Or they would touch the lips, or they would use chopsticks and hold food very close up to the deceased. Some anthropologists argue that that's a way in which you maintain a relationship, a bond, with the deceased. Others say that you feed the dead because you want to appease them. You want to make sure they don't get angry, they don't avenge themselves on the living. But we have therefore an enormously detailed set of ritual texts in China that describe how you should feed the dead, how you should surround the coffin with all sorts of pots and pans and cookery toys, as you see here on an example, and how, for example, you should use ice to keep the body, in good shape, and the caskets and the funerary coffins in good shape. The terminology that is being used when describing the layout of tombs is all touching, on the world of cuisine, cooking. How does this translate in terms of the way in which the ancient Chinese thought about life hereafter? Did they believe that human beings had a soul, and did these souls require nourishment? Well, we know from a number of texts that the ancient Chinese may have believed that all of us have two types of soul. We have one soul which is corporeal, which sits inside the body. And when we die, that particular soul returns to the earth, to the soil. We have another soul which is more ethereal, more spirit-like. And when we die, that particular soul moves up into the cosmos at large. So part of us is tied back to the natural world, to the soil, and part of us evaporates. Now we have descriptions of funerary rituals in which a priest, during the period between death and the time in which the funerary would start, where a priest would rise on top of the roof of the family compound of the deceased, and he would perform all sorts of rituals in which he is trying to call back one of these souls that has just left the body. The belief there is that if you can recall the soul, entice the soul to join the body again, somebody might live longer or become immortal. And this is a very famous poem in ancient Chinese literature, which we know as the summoning or the summons of the soul. And this is the text that the priest uses to lure the soul to come back to the body. Soul, please come back. Choice things are spread out before you. 4 kinds of wine have been subtly blended, not rasping to the throat. Clear and fragrant, ice-cool liquor, not for base men to drink. And white yeasts have been mixed with musts of wu to make a clear true wine. O soul, come back. Do not be afraid. So you see what's going on here is the way in which you entice the soul back into the body is by literally reading off a menu of the most exotic and tasteful things that you can imagine. Now, whether or not people in practice, performed this ritual very often, we don't know. Most of the sources we have of any ancient civilization, of course, tend to be prescriptive. In other words, they tell us what should happen. They don't necessarily describe what has happened. But what remains central, though, is the idea that the soul, or for lack of a better word, that the welfare of the dead was closely related to the intake of food. And you can see this in Chinese archaeology. Here you have an example of a very famous tomb from the Western Han period. It dates to 168 BC. And this was a tomb that is very famous for a number of texts that were found in it, but also for culinary objects. And most importantly, a compartment in the tomb, which is what you see on the left side, which was the dining room of the lady who was buried there. And if you can see, the photo is obviously a black and white here, but you can see the dishes are still laid out there in this dining room, this subterranean dining room. And it also shows us that the lady was using chopsticks. You can see chopsticks on some of the plates at the bottom here. So this is just an example really of the type of archaeological or artifacts and objects that we have that really sort of illustrate these theoretical ideas a little bit in practice. Now, we don't quite know whether the desire, the hope to feed the soul should be linked with aspirations to keep the body physically immortal or to make sure that people live longer. Partly, we don't know much about this, partly because we only have the texts that tell us how it should be in an ideal situation, but more importantly, what makes it very difficult when you study ancient China is that we have very little or very few examples in which the body was physically preserved. And physical preservation of bodies, like embalmment, for example, was not as widespread in China, and certainly nowhere as widespread compared, for example, to ancient Egypt. Actually, we only have two nice examples, and the best example of a preserved body in ancient China is the body of this particular lady in the right bottom corner. That's how she may have looked, and the other two slides are what she looked like. This is Lady Dai, who was the lady who occupied the tomb of which I just showed the dining room. We have a feeling that Chinese elites and aristocrats probably accepted the decomposition of the body as a matter of fact. Very rarely does this seem to be a polemical discussion. In the case of this particular body, the only reason why she may have been preserved to the way she has was that abnormally high levels of mercury and lead were found in the body, which suggested that she was probably inhaling or drinking or imbibing elixirs, that she believed might help her might help her to gain immortality. And actually, if you take in too much mercury, you poison the body gradually, and she may have poisoned herself at a fairly young age, which is why we may still have her with us today in the state she is. Now, interestingly, we have the stomach contents of this lady, because we knew what her last meal was. And so it's been an extremely interesting experiment, an extremely interesting piece of evidence to get insight into this particular issue. In tombs, you will therefore always find plates and pots and cookery vessels that are set out, to nourish the ancestors. Or you might, as in the two slides on this particular presentation here, you might see miniature figurines in ceramic of animals, pigs, and geese, and chickens. All of these are there to supply, feasts and banquets in the afterlife. Now, so important, apparently, was the idea that you should feed your ruler properly, that cooks at times were buried together with their masters. And we have examples of this. So important was it that entire cooking facilities had to be replicated in miniature and put into tombs. So here you have a ladle, you have a pot. On top there you have an oven, and these things are small. These are just tiny terracotta miniature objects. And at the bottom there you have a toilet, a privy. And you see a little pig in the pen. So the idea was that, you would relieve yourself, and the pigs then would feed on whatever is being, whatever you relieve yourself of. We have granaries, storage compartments in which you store grains. At the bottom here we have something that looks like almost like a barbecue set in miniature. And we have again another furnace here, another stove. So it's quite important, to sort of to get a sense of how real this must have been in the visual culture of funerary practice in ancient China. Now, what did you feed your ancestors? Well, that depended on obviously how rich you were. That depends on the status of the ancestors, and that depends also, of course, on what you wish to achieve with feeding your ancestors. We know, according to one text, that Confucius, China's foremost philosopher, that Confucius very much appreciated the use of millet or grain in an ancestral temple, and he dismissed the use of fruit. As a matter of fact, in one episode he dismisses peaches as the lowest amongst all fruits, and you should never offer these to the ancestors. But sometimes, of course, these things were coincidental. What we do know is that when making sacrifices to ancestors publicly, and when using and killing animals to feed to the ancestors, usually organs that included a great deal of blood and a great deal of qi, a great deal of air, were most valuable. So you would sacrifice the lungs, for example, as a primary ingredient, as a primary offering, because it is full of blood, and the lungs are also full of qi. But amongst anything and the entire gamut of things you could feed to the ancestors, the most central sacrificial offering was the stew, the geng, pronounced in Chinese. And don't worry, the examples of stews and soups on the slide here are from contemporary China. We don't find them, obviously, in this delicious format. But the stew is extremely important. First of all, what was the stew? It could consist of various things. We have examples of stews that have lots of meat in it. We have vegetable stews. We have stews with dog meat, stews with turtle meat. So the actual ingredients are varied, and they must have varied, of course, according to time, region, availability, and season, and so on. But why is this particular stew so important in Chinese religion? Well, it is because the stew symbolized the idea of harmony. In other words, in a stew, you mix ingredients and you blend them in such a way that none of the ingredients stand out, but that all these peculiar ingredients blend into a harmonious whole. And so very often, therefore, to cook a soup, to cook a stew, and to offer a stew imparts the idea of being in harmony, with the people that surround you or with the ancestors, and so on. Now, what is very interesting about the stew is that there were very clear instructions as to how you should prepare the stew in order to get the attention of your ancestors. And this is how it worked. I'm trying to put this on a graph here. Basically, when you offer a soup or a stew to your ancestors, you you make sure that the ancestors that are nearest to you, in other words, the ancestors that have departed recently, are being offered a stew that is fairly tasty. In other words, it has flavor. In other words, if you want, you may remember your great-grandmother, and you may remember that your great-grandmother liked a particular ingredient, while she was alive. So when you are trying to sacrifice to your great-grandmother, you're trying to sacrifice or offer something that might make a sensory connection with your great-grandmother. Now, when you go up the ladder of the ancestors, you don't know what your ancestor 2 or 3 centuries before may have liked. And so what you do then is, the higher the category of ancestors, the more distant your ancestors are in time, the less flavor you use in the sacrificial offerings. In other words, you de-flavor the soup. And ultimately, the ritual texts tell us it is the tasteless soup, the tasteless stew, that is the most powerful offering, because the tasteless stew is symbolizing perfect harmony, and actually the tasteless stew can be mixed with any ingredients that any ancestors that you target might like. Also, when you offer drinks, when you offer sacrificial wine to the ancestors, the ritual codes tell us that the most honored sacrificial beverage you can offer to the ancestors is water. And it describes water actually as dark wine, mysterious wine. And the idea is exactly the same, because it is flavorless. So what this tells us is that ancestors in the spirit world operate on a different sensory level as we living beings. For us living beings, we like flavor, we like tastes, and that is how we connect with each other. The ancestors, they like chi, they like vapor, they like that unexpressed bit of energy that comes out of a sacrificial offering, and therefore they don't necessarily like flavor. For those amongst you who have ever been in the Chinese world, or have ever visited a Chinese temple, or have ever visited shops near Chinese temples, you'll find that amongst many of the sacrificial offerings that you can purchase there to sacrifice to your ancestors, you find, for example, flavorless or tasteless cakes and all sorts of ingredients or all sorts of foodstuffs that are entirely insipid. They're not palatable, and yet they're being offered. So you adapt the food according to the hierarchy of the spirits that you want to address. And so by de-flavoring, in other words, by taking the flavor out of your offerings, you create the most efficient sacrificial offering. This is important because you could run a risk. The risk of offering the wrong sacrificial offering to your ancestors, in other words, a soup that tastes one way or another, is that your ancestors will not like it. And they will literally avenge the living, for having, offered them the wrong sacrificial offerings. Now, it is not simply the dead ancestors who are eating and are being fed, but the living, while they are performing sacrifices to the ancestors, also need to subject themselves to a serious dietary regime. If your relatives passed away, you had to go through a cycle, a dietary cycle, that was fairly rigid. At least if you were an aristocrat, if you belonged to the elites, and if you could afford, obviously, to engage in mourning ceremonies. The rituals tells us that meat, the eating of meat, has to be minimized during periods of ritual purification, and especially during the mourning period. And let's not forget, the mourning period, in other words, the period in which you wail and mourn and think about the dead in traditional China, could last 27 months. So the prescription required people to be inactive for nearly 3 years. That means no labor, it means no sex, which theoretically is impossible, given the emphasis on male offspring, but that's the prescription. It goes on for 3 years. So only aristocrats or people who could afford it could, theoretically speaking, put themselves through this. But theoretically what happened is you stop meat at the beginning of the morning period, and you only eat congee, vegetables, fruits. And as you pass through the 3 years, the closer you get to the end of it, the more you start eating your usual foods again. So you start taking wine again and taking meat again. So between the point of death and the end of the mourning period, you as a relative, as somebody who has to feed the ancestors, has to remember the ancestors, you put yourself through a process too, in which you abstain both from flavor, also in the clothes that you wear. You drop wearing multicolored clothes, you wear white clothes only, and as gradually you move back to the world of the living, as you resume normal life, you then take back the normal diet and the ingredients that symbolize, of course, the status of anybody of power in early China, that is being able to afford meat and being able to drink wine or ale. There are exceptions in these mourning regulations. Older people, for example, are relieved of some of the stringent prescriptions. People who are ill are relieved of some of the more stringent prescriptions. Confucius, philosopher, even says that during the mourning period you have to be careful that you do not emaciate the body to such a degree that you endanger your own health and that you endanger bodily hygiene. And the thinking there is that as a descendant of somebody who has departed, one way in which you respect the deceased ancestors is by maintaining your own body. So you can starve yourself to a certain degree, but you cannot, of course, go through extreme lengths and risk losing life or becoming very ill. Confucius himself is very prominent in discussions about diet, about the sacrifice of food to the ancestors. And of course, while we never know that sayings ascribed to Confucius, are pronounced by the historical Confucius, we do know that the image that is portrayed of him in texts is that he is a man of balance. According to the Confucian Analects, which is a text of dialogues that he has with his disciples that has come to us, Confucius, for example, would never eat to the full when somebody who was mourning was present with him. So he would respect somebody who was mourning by not eating much himself. He would also never fail to change his diet during the fasting periods. He would never keep or eat sacrificial meats 2 or 3 days after the sacrifice. In other words, when they would potentially no longer good. He would always first offer a little bit of his food to his own ancestors before he started his own meal. And very importantly, one feature Confucius is known for is that he would never get drunk. And he would never get drunk during funerals. Now this might strike you as very odd, but imagine, during a period of 3 years, we have sacrificial rituals organized in which the key ingredient is food. And so you can imagine that, some of these funerals, were huge occasions in which there was a lot of sacrificial food going around. Meat was being offered to the ancestors, wines were laid out, fruits were laid out. And so we know from anecdotal evidence that there were people who would drag themselves from one funeral to another because it was an occasion to get free alcohol and free meat. So the funeral, in other words, the feeding of the ancestors then became again a way in which you had a social bond amongst some of the living. Now I'd like to take you to a set of artifacts which some of you may have been familiar with or have seen somewhere in museums worldwide. But these are examples of ritual bronze vessels we have of the Shang and Zhou periods, all of which are in essence food vessels. The idea underlying these kind of objects are very complex, but they do relate to one core idea. That is, that whatever you feed your ancestors and the living influences their behavior. It influences the psychology of people, whether it's people who are alive or whether it's people who are already dead. If you educate somebody to become a prince, to have a role of significance in society, you make sure you feed them properly. And so we have, for example, texts that tell us that if the young prince is naughty, you should take his meat away. And interestingly, the word for sacrificial meat in Chinese sounds the same as the word for goodness, for virtue. And so the idea is that if you take away the meat, you take away his potential of growing into a good boy. And if he behaves properly, he can eat meat again. We know that diet influences the fetus of the unborn child, or at least that is what the Chinese believed. So you start to feed the fetus. You start to feed and influence the psychology and the development of the young child before it is born. We have dietary manuals that tell us what you should eat as a pregnant woman and what you should avoid. We have a wonderful story of the mother of a famous Chinese philosopher who was a disciple of Confucius, the philosopher Mencius, and she would only sit properly on a mat and only eat food that was neatly cut up in equal proportions while she was pregnant. And the idea here was that she wanted her young boy, her fetus, to acquire a sense of balance, of measure, and therefore all bits of food that she would eat would be perfectly balanced and perfectly cut up. The idea here is that by eating certain things, you transform and you educate the character of the fetus in a certain way. A man's surroundings transform his air in the same way as the food that he eats changes his body. That was the principle here. Now this same notion, in other words, that you can, in other words, sustain the moral health of a person through food, underlies the use of these vessels too. Because these vessels, in essence, were there, to offer sacrifices to the ancestors. Concretely, these vessels contained all sorts of sacrificial ingredients, but importantly, certainly, from the Zhou period onwards, these vessels on the inside had inscriptions. You see an example of this on this slide. This is the inside of a bronze vessel. Now these inscriptions describe usually, an important political event. Sometimes these inscriptions are wishes for offspring. Sometimes these inscriptions describe the achievements of a particular king or a feudal lord. But it's interesting that the inscriptions are on the inside of the vessels. You are not meant to see these as participants in the ritual. The idea is that these texts, through the food and through the vapor of the sacrificial offerings in the vessels, are sent off to the spirit world. In other words, you send them a message by trying to send them a text through the means of food. And it's wonderful, of course, because that's how these inscriptions have been preserved. We also have texts of the time that tell us that one should be very careful in what one offers to the ancestors. And one important notion is that as a dynasty takes over from another dynasty, almost invariably the last few kings of a particular dynasty are being accused of being over-indulgent and not respecting the proper rules of sacrifice. In other words, you'll find in Chinese historiography almost a standard image, namely that last rulers, final rulers, are rulers that are usually drunk, that instead of offering the offerings to the ancestors, eat them or drink them themselves. And so we do have several of these inscriptions in which actually that word and that accusation is made. We also have poems, as I just showed you another set of these, poems of the time that describe the procedure in which you offer sacrifices to the spirits. And in one or two of these examples, we find the expression that the spirits are only satisfied when they are drunk. In other words, when they have had enough. And the idea is then that as people sacrifice and participate in these events, they eat and ingest some of the leftovers of the sacrificial offerings at the end, of the ceremony. We know that heaven, the supreme political or the supreme power that grants political legitimacy to new rulers, has reacted, according to our historiographers, to bad behavior of rulers around the sacrificial altars. We even have one beautiful description of the ancestors literally vomiting out the sacrificial offerings again, saying, we don't want to accept offerings from descendants who are basically morally defunct. So this is interesting because alcohol and overindulgence in food is very intricately linked to historiography and to the way in which you perceive whether somebody is powerful, efficient in what he does or not. And of course the same way, abstaining from food is also interpreted in various ways as, reflecting on one's morality. I've got a few examples here of, later drawings of the types of scenes, that one may have seen at the time. Sacrificial kitchens, you see, from the Han period, with fish and meat and ham laid out there. But let me try and come to, a few concluding remarks. What really is something that we should think about very carefully when thinking about Chinese food, even today when you walk into a Chinese restaurant, or even when you're being offered a piece of fruit or a piece of food, or even the token pack of tea that your Chinese visitors and dignitaries and friends might have for you, is that feeding and food is never only about nourishment, and it is never only about the nourishment of the living. In the same way as you exchange sacrificial meat in ancient China, the acceptance or the refusal of food gifts and the social interplay and etiquette during banquets, during feasts, were so important that they can reinforce or break political alliances and relationships amongst people. And so this is an extremely important backdrop to trying to understand some of the ritualized movements that go on sometimes during official banquets, even in China today. As a matter of fact, if you look at the way in which diplomatic missions, to Beijing, for example, during state banquets are being wined and dined, and if you compare the seating arrangements and some of the sequence, of the dishes, and some of the hierarchies of the guests and the toasting arrangements, the way in which people drink and toast each other, and you compare that with the ritual texts from the 2nd century BC, very little has changed. It seems as if all of this is still happening, today. A balanced diet for the living, or a balanced sacrificial menu, together with controlled avoidances of food, or preferences for certain foods during key stages in life were absolutely essential in maintaining the relationship between the living and the dead. What perhaps most usages or most reflections on food culture in traditional China have in common is the knowledge that by cooking, by consuming, and by offering food, you are playing with notions and with tensions between beliefs on harmony, order, and proportion on the one hand, and a potential for indulgence and immoderation on the other. This is the essential of course, eating and drinking in community. Food brings people together, but if you have too much of it, of course, it turns the whole thing into a chaotic, dysfunctional gathering. Chinese thinkers and ritualists exploited culinary and sacrificial culture as almost a moral pendulum as it moved back and forth between extremes of fasting and feasting, offering and receiving, physical nourishment or ritual purification. So food united and divided, and this applied both to the physiology of the living as well as to the moral well-being of the spirit world. And I would like to end not with these two ladies preparing not Beijing duck, but clearly fowl or chicken in the Han period, but I'd like to end with this particular slide, because this is a shot from the closing ceremony of the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And what you see here is actors dressed up as the philosopher Confucius. And they are holding copies of the Confucian Analects, a foundational text in their hands, texts that are written on bamboo slips. They're performing a dance, and towards the end of the ceremony, they form this formation at the back that shows this particular Chinese character. You can see on top of that group of people on the bottom slide. That particular Chinese character is the Chinese character he. That particular character is also the verb that means to mix a stew, to blend all ingredients into one harmonious soup. So one can actually say and argue that one of the key concepts that even the Chinese government has in mind today, namely the harmonious society, making sure that people live together in harmony and that nobody sticks out, that actually that whole notion of harmony is a culinary concept. And that's something, of course, none of us would ever imagine when we walk into a Chinese restaurant. But there it is for you at the Beijing Olympics. Thank you very much.
Ringrazio il professore STERCKX e promettiamo che quando andremo in un ristorante cinese ci ricorderemo dei principi dell'armonia. Grazie.
Vi ricordiamo che stasera alle 21 nel Salone del Maggior Consiglio il Governo del Corpo, un omaggio a Piero Camporesi, una lettura scenica di Angela Finocchiaro e musiche di Vladimir Denisenko.
Nothing like this. I mean, this puts the French and the Italian sort of,